Hello, everyone, and welcome to the stream. When we left off last, it would seem that although Shojirou is incredibly terrible at making tea, Alice has decided that she's willing to cohabitate, so here we go. Interesting title for a chapter. Chapter 8. Are you for real? Miyazaki High School's winter vacation began in mid-December. The tranquil air of the school was a refreshing change of pace from the more competitive schools and their nationally famous sports teams and exam-oriented curriculum. The empty, newly constructed building invoked images of pure white swan descending upon a still winter lake. The modern school building felt alive in its stillness in spite of the absence of its lifeblood of students. Most students never knew what this building used to look like. It was just a small, run-down wooden building, a shadow of its former self. The former school was never torn down and now stood in lonely silence. It was tucked away deep in a seemingly infinite wood that stretched across the mountains. That seems like a rather idyllic location for a school, if you ask me. The sound of the broom sweeping dead leaves resonated in the air. The ocean of leaves had accumulated into piles as big as sand dunes. Sweeping was a futile venture at this point. An ominous feeling lingered in the air, perhaps the result of 2 years of abandonment. Cleaning the inside of this building alone would take more than a few days to finish. Not to mention...
ほんとだりー、存在価値が見出せねえ。ばっかじゃねえの？冬休みは短いってのになんでこんなことやらせんだよ、生徒会は。
The misguided youth sent here for the job wasted no time making it clear he wanted no part in the beautification efforts.
っていうかジャージでやらせんなよ。ジャンパーぐらい着させろよな。
Stop complaining and work harder. You'll warm up.
何これ、もしかして体育の補習？寒中マラソン？俺体育だけはサボったことねえんすけどね。
Of course, I'm not one to talk. I'm stuck inside of a box 24 hours a day, so... Hozoki Kinomi continued to mumble and grumble to himself as he reluctantly swept away at the ground. Meanwhile, Shojirou silently and swiftly continued his sweeping, glaring at Kinomi out of the corner of his eye.
おい、何真面目にやってんだよ。こんなの適当でいいんだって。だいたい40人しかいねえのにこんな山みたいな庭の掃除なんか終わるかってんだ。
終わらないことなんてない。
Especially not with that attitude.
少しうるさいぞ、木の実は。
Kinomi went back to idly swinging his broom without even glancing over at Shojirou. Mornings on the mountain were cold. There was no hint of sun in the cloudy sky above. Ash-gray light illuminated the rear courtyard. The sharp cold of midwinter pierced through everyone's gloves as if they did not exist. A day like this was best spent indoors under warm blankets, but for some reason, they were out here cleaning. The Special Winter Cleaning Team. This was the name given to this elite force of students to clean up this dilapidated, overgrown mountain. The other students had put their faith into this team to fulfill this beautification mission, respecting them for their sacrifice. The reality, however, was that this was nothing more than a ragtag, dare-losing gang of students needed remedial lessons before their exams. They were the victims of a year-long arm-twisting scheme by the student council. Who in their right mind would come out here to sweep up leaves with a blizzard looming on the horizon? Other than one of the 40 assembled, none of them had any semblance of interest in the task at hand.
おい見ろよしずき、赤羽たち向こうで焼き芋とかレトロな真似してやがる。2番煎じはいかにも頭悪いしな。そうだ、俺たちはイカでも焼かねえ？
Roasted sweet potatoes. I want roasted sweet potatoes. I'll take some grilled squid too, though. That sounds good. Kinomi did not want to be here to begin with, and was constantly trying to break Shojirou into joining him. The cleaning squad was divided into groups. Shojirou and Kinomi were in charge of cleaning behind the gymnasium. Shojirou was the leader of the platoon. Kinomi was the grunt.
ああ、こことあっちの垣根をきれいにしたら、焼き芋だろうと焼きイカだろうと猫鍋だろうと好きにしよう。その頃にはちょうどお昼だ。
Stab. Shojirou said as he expertly packed his swept leaves into trash bags. 2 hours had passed since they assembled on this foggy morning at 7 o'clock. While everyone else chattered and laughed as they worked, Shojirou alone had worked in complete silence at the same blistering pace since he started. The sheer amount of work he put in was likely the only thing keeping him from complaining of the cold in his thin jersey. Exactly. If the rest of them worked just as hard, not only would it get done fairly quickly, but they'd stay warm in the process.
とにかくそこの池らしきものだってカチカチに凍ってるぐらいなんだぜ。
So move faster.
こんな雪原じゃ人体は普通動かねえよ。機械伯爵でもなきゃだよ。そろそろ人間狩りが始まるよ。
Matt, if he complained, if he worked half as hard as he complained.
せっかく枯葉集めたんだから燃やして温まんないとさ。どうせ監視役は殿下しかいないんだしさ。なあ、焼きイカやろうぜ。焼きイカ。
For some reason, Kinomi was droning on about his squid. Shojirou had managed to withstand the barrage of complaints from his comrade, but even he was reaching his limit.
木の実、頼むから。
Just then, Shojirou saw the Grim Reaper himself creeping behind Kinomi. In his hand he held a rake instead of a soft bamboo broom.
いいぜ。お前がイカなんてもんを用意してるほどの大人物だってんなら、慎んでイカ焼きぐらい許可してやるよ。なんなら醤油はこっちで用意してやろう。
Kinomi shot to attention at the voice behind him.
その物言い、築地何がし。
before quickly turning around, swinging his broom in the process. Tobimaro easily blocked the swing with his rake.
ああ、てめえ、やる気十分じゃねえか。溢れる労働意欲を抑えきれないってわけか。なんならシベリアコースにでも行っちまう
That
か。
sounds even worse than what they're doing right now, to be honest.
女ども集めて焼却炉に陣取ってる野郎の言葉なんざ聞かねえよ。真冬に南国気分とかマジ寒いわ。
Both boys glared at each other with a wiry smile, broom and rake locked in an embrace. The two were only friends with each other on school grounds.
飛び丸、一応彼は戦力なんだから邪魔しないでくれ。
Both of them scoffed angrily and put away their weapons. They both knew better than to argue with Shojirou, the only one cleaning with garbage bags in hand.
それで何しに来たんだ飛び丸。君はあったかい焼却炉の前で永遠に火の管理をすると豪語していたんじゃなかったっけ？
Oh, harsh. Exactly, a harsh comment. Apparently, even Shojirou had a slight taste for drama.
なんてこった。善良な生徒ですら俺をそんな目で見るのか。
Well, I mean, maybe he should do more than pretend to take care of the fire then. Tobimaro seemed sad at Shojirou's observation. Rightly so. But as long as Tobimaru continued to claim he was helping the girls clean by doing nothing more than standing in front of a pile of burning leaves, Shojirou found it hard to sympathize.
いいから要件を言えよ。殿下と違って俺らは暇じゃねえんだ。
ああ、そうかよ。宗次郎、そろそろ小休止だ。向こうで温まろうよ。
お、なんだブレイクかよ。話せるじゃん殿
Oh,
下。
now he's perfectly fine. What a guy.
ああ、てめえは除外に決まってんだろ。特権は功労者にのみ与えられるもんだ。
Haha, sucker.
焼却炉の前に来たけりゃ、それ相応の貢ぎ物を持ってきやがれ。具体的に言うと、リアカー1台分のゴミ袋な。
ひっで生徒会応募。
Not really. It's only fair that only those that have been working should get to take a break. I mean, technically, he's been taking a break the whole time, so... Kinomi's complaints naturally fell on deaf ears. Tobimaru had been selected to lead the cleaning operation, and his word was final. If Kinomi were to continue to push his buttons, he knew he would be on cleaning duty tomorrow, and the next day too.
さあ、行くぞ。誰の趣味か知らねえが、なぜか汁粉の缶が山ほどあってな。中華まんの一つでもあった方が気が利くってもんなんだがね。あれか？遭難用のチョコレートみたいなもんか？
Emergency chocolate and sweet red bean soup.
たく、あいつの考えは未だにわかんねえな。
Shojirou reassured Tobimaru by saying that he thought the food would do just fine for everyone.
なんだよ。行かねえのか、宗次郎。
ああ、自分はここに残るよ。旦なら木の実の言うように葉を燃やせばいい。そこに池もある。火の始末なら安心だ。
This was clearly for Kinomi's benefit. Tobimaru furrowed his brow, while Kinomi shivered from the cold. But he was just fine when he thought it was break time.
俺は今友情ってもんを実感している。すげえな。真心って本当にあったんだ。
Suck up, you little brown nosed suck up.
くそ
God.
待ってろしずき、今赤羽たちから芋を奪ってくる。
Perhaps shy to show his true feelings, Kinomi ran off to the neighboring group.
な、予想はしてたけどな。
Tobimaru pulled out a hot can from his jersey pocket, scratching his head in expiration. He pulled out 3 in all, one from each jersey pocket and one from his pants pocket.
さっさと焚き火の用意をしようぜ。俺もこっちで休むことにするわ。
付き合いがいいのはお互い様だな。
Shojirou quickly prepared the leaves for the fire, carefully gathering them up to burn neatly. Yes, that.
慣れてるな。
マッチがあるから楽なんだ。
Shojirou crouched down in front of the burning leaves and warmed his hands near the flames. Even though he showed no signs of being cold, underneath it all, Shojirou was cold too. He gazed into the fire as the smoke rose from the pile of leaves, as if remembering the good times from his past. Tobimaru felt a touch of concern as he looked at Shojirou. He saw within him the homesickness and retrospection. He also saw a dark shadow looming over him, like a stranger in a foreign land without a home.
元気ねえな、宗次郎。
まあね、少し疲れてる。
Suppose anybody would be tired after the shit Shojirou's been through for the last, 3 months.
悩み事なら相談に乗るぜ。気が向いたら話してくれ。
Tobimaru continued speaking with the pull tab from the can of sweet red bean soup still around his index finger. Shojirou was focused on the fire.
そういえばな、お前が学校休んでる時、青崎に殴られたぜ。なんでも俺は大ボラ吹きだそうだ。
すごいな。大抜擢じゃないか。
Sometimes Shojirou would reply incoherently like this. Congratulations, you got slugged by Aoko? Oh, what a guy. What a guy. Tobimaru chalked it up to cultural differences.
なあ、青崎とはどうなってんだ？テスト前は駅まで一緒に帰ってただろ？うまくいってんのか、あれから。
It was obvious to everyone that was far from the case, yet Tobimaru asked anyway.
ああ、今は一緒に住んでるよ。
Oh shit. That is probably a little blunter than he should have been. Shojirou went with the truthful, blunt response.
ああ、そうか、一緒と来たか。
Not quite. Tobimaru tried to laugh off Shojirou's all too casual confession, however.
はっ、一緒に住んでると。
Like dots on Marblehead. Took a second for the bubble to reach the top.
どうした飛び丸。ヒデも飛んだか？
飛んでねえし、それより怖え。おい、今の聞き捨てならねえたわごとは本当の話か？
Shojirou protested Tobimaru's reply with silence.
その余裕、マジか。女に興味なさそうな顔してて、やることやってんじゃねえかてめえ。
It wasn't by choice. It was not by choice. And I mean, it's better to be in a bottle. Tobimaru had always felt he and Shojirou were an equal match strength-wise, but for some reason he could not shake the feeling that Shojirou was now his superior in the brain department. Shojirou cast a rare angry glare in Tobimaru's direction.
こっちこそ聞き捨てならない。
That was awfully rude.
なんだその女に興味はないってのは。
Oh, that's the awfully rude part. That he thought he wasn't interested in. Oh, wow. Shojiro's obliviousness continues to baffle me. It's great. It's so much fun. Shojirou seemed genuinely angry. His voice was icy. This uncharacteristic level of anger from Shojirou was enough to get Tobimaru to back down.
いや、悪い。そんな雰囲気あったんだよ、お前さんは。それは謝る。けどよ、青崎と一緒に住んでるってどういうことだ。いくらなんでも一足飛びすぎだろ。
別に君が期待しているようなことはない。彼女が住んでいるところの部屋を借りることになっただけだ。
Well, I mean, that's not quite exactly it either, but sure, we'll go with that he's just renting the room.
山小屋を思い出すんで気に入ってる。
I mean, the rest of us know he's renting it because he has no choice. Tobimaru did not bat an eyelid at hearing that Shojirou now lived in an attic and continued his questioning.
屋敷って、あのクオンジの屋敷か。
Yes, the Kuonji mansion.
それこそまさかだぜ。宗十郎、お前一体どんな手品を使いやがった？
飛び丸こそあの家を知ってるのか？
そりゃな。これでも築地家期待の跡取り候補だぜ、俺は。クオンジグループのご令嬢が住んでる屋敷ぐらいは知ってるさ。霊園女学院の2年生だろ、確か。
He is indeed.
何？
Yes. Yes, Shojirou. Shojirou was looking more confused than ever, so Tobimaru reluctantly explained everything as simply as he could so Shojirou could understand.
クオンジグループ。つか、財団だな。平たく言えば、一族全部がお金持ちで、仲良く会社を経営してる連中だと思えばいい。複合企業とまではいかないが、輸出業じゃかなりのもんだ。ホームグラウンドは国外で、先代の会長の英国びいきがたたって、一時期は沈みかけてたんだが、5年くらい前かね。本拠地をこっちに移してからは、ご存知の
More likely
通り
because
だ。
they got kicked out of the clock tower. Or kicked out of the Mages Association.
会長が息子に移ってからはき
Which
ちん
is
と持ち直し
based
て、
in the
今や
clock
町
tower
の
in
名士だ
London.
ろ。ここでもクオンジの名前はそこかしこで目に入る。この学校の立て直し予算の半分は連中からだしな。
Despite the oversimplified explanation, Shojirou seemed to not be getting it. With that, Tobimaru decided to give up on trying to explain.
あれだ。想像もできない金持ちってこ
It's
と。
probably all you needed to say.
宗の字が働いてる喫茶店だって、クオンジが向こうから持ってきたブランドだぜ。今じゃ全国チェーンになっちまったがな。
Damn.
つまりすごく偉いんだね。おかしいな。ならなんであんなに倹約してるんだろう。
Shojirou mumbled incoherently to himself. Tobimaru looked at him with a complex expression on his face, somewhere between envy and heartfelt sympathy.
しかし、うまいことやったな、宗十郎。
Well, I don't know about that.
それで、本当のところはどうなんだ？男と女が同じ屋根の下にいれば、やることは一つだろ？
I'm not sure being forced to live there under threat of death is, doing good for yourself. But anyway.
案外古いな、飛び丸も。
抜かせ。そのあたりをごまかしてたら、男なんざやってらんねえ。
そりゃごもっとも。実を言うと、
Though Shojirou and Aoko were living together, there was absolutely no chemistry between them. Though that was not to say that living in such close quarters as they did, unintended mishaps did not occur from time to time. But even still,
驚くぐらいそういうことにはなってない。あの屋敷すごく広いし。
everyone was often busy with their own affairs, so there was no opportunity for that sort of thing to happen.
そもそもだな。もし飛び丸だったら、下宿先が同じってことだけで青崎に言い寄る気になるかい？
いや、ならねえな、そりゃ。
I mean, he probably wouldn't suddenly make advances on Aozaki, regardless of whether he was living under the same roof or not. I think she's hit him enough times that he probably doesn't want to go there. Tobimaru nodded intently as if he was thinking back over his many ex-relationships.
いやー、健全だな。
ああ、
Yes,
健
very
全だろ。
wholesome, actually. Sure. Shojirou gave no more than a quick affirmation to Tobimaru's despondent murmur. He was doing fine. But beside the physical health, it was surely Shojirou's personality that enabled him to maintain any semblance of peace, dealing with both Aoko and Alice while living in that mansion.
でも、それとは別の話で、青崎には頭が上がらないんだ。彼女にはもう返せない借りがあってさ。
Shojirou's eyes turned slightly serious as he stared into the fire. Tobimaru felt that there was more to those words than what Shojirou was letting on.
もう返せない借りだ。
He does indeed. Shojirou merely nodded in silence at Tobimaru's inquisitive acknowledgement. And just then, a strange scream pierced through the still silence of the wood like a knife.
なんか聞こえたな。
ああ、木の実だ。
Shojirou had already stood up before he responded. He bolted to the frozen pond, broke the ice with his broom, scooped up some of the frigid water in a bucket, and threw it on the fire, all in less than 10 seconds. Holy damn, that is fast! Then he immediately ran off into the depths of the woods from where he heard the scream. Tobimaru followed after him in panicked confusion.
飛び丸、この先に何かあるのか？
確か旧校舎が残ってるはずだ。
他には野犬の住処とかそういう嫌な話は？
はあ？いや、いるとしても鹿かウサギじゃねえか。
Now what the hell
な
got
ら
him?
怖がることもないか。急ごう。
Perhaps because of his time spent growing up in the mountains, Shojirou quickly sprinted over the slippery dead leaves. Tobimaru was not particularly cautious himself, but nevertheless, he could not keep up with Shojirou in here. Before long, Shojirou found himself running alone. When the foliage blocked the natural trail, he would sometimes clear it away by brute force, but just as often he would expertly weave through the brush. It was clear that he was used to dealing with this level of nature. After a few minutes, Shojirou arrived at a clearing. The wall of trees had ended. It was an obvious man-made clearing here on the mountainside. In the distance was what looked like an old wooden school building. It was a small, aesthetically pleasing building no longer than an elementary school, lost in the depths of a winter wilderness.
木の実
Kinomi stood alone on the old school's grounds.
なんでしずきまで追いかけてきたん？
Well, you screamed like a little bitch, so he came running. A sour expression came over Shojiro's face as as Kinome tilted his head in confusion.
そっちこそどうしたんだ変な声上げて。
声？いや、そりゃガキ相手に怒鳴ったけどよ。ほら、あのガキだよ。芋持ってるだろ。って中に逃げ込みやがった。
Hinomi pointed resentfully toward the old school building. There was indeed someone standing in the entrance of the building, just over 300 feet in the distance.
ったく、こんな上まで来やがって。いつから子供の遊び場になってんだ、ここ。
Hinomi shrugged his shoulders to signal how little he cared what the young children did with their time. This place was deep in the woods, but it was not particularly dangerous. Shojirou had run through the wood to get here, but there was also a paved road leading to this spot from outside the woods too. Kinomi apparently followed that road to get here.
ん子供
Shojirou squinted.
ああ、金髪なんでさっきはちょっと驚いたけどな。外国人の子供ってなんか怖いだろ？
It was indeed quite rare to see a foreigner in a provincial town such as Mizaki. Shojirou had never seen a foreigner in person, which made the whole thing even more mysterious.
それで木の実はなんでここまで
いや、赤羽たちがよ、ガキに食料奪われたって言うからここまで追いかけてきたんだ。そういうことだから、二人がかりであのお子様とっちめようぜ。
怖いことを考えるな木の実は。
Shojirou could not find it in him to agree with this plan. It seemed unfair to team up against a little kid.
いいから帰ろう。あの子こっちを睨んでるじゃないか。それに飛び丸にこんなところ見られたら、冬休み中ずっと山の掃除で終わることになるぞ。
Shojirou took Kinomi by the shoulder and began leading him back to the path that he came from. Kinomi cast one last gaze at the old school building before reluctantly following. Just then, Tobimaru appeared, panting and out of breath.
早いな、宗十郎。
He was raised on the side of a mountain, I would assume, is how he's so fast. Tobimaru could hardly catch his breath. He arrived about 3 minutes behind Shojirou, despite having a good set of legs on him.
それでどうした？木の実、無事か？
は？無事も何も殿下こそどったん。
Kinomi seemed perplexed at Tobimaru's first ever display of concern for him.
なんだそりゃ。てめえ、あれだけの大声を上げておいて、しらばっくれる気か？上で何かあったんだろうが。
すまない。こっちの早とちりだった。飛び丸は知らないだろうけど、木の実は時々バイト先でも規制を上げる癖があるんだ。
Kinomi looked disapproving as Shojirou nonchalantly shared this insight. This was the first he'd ever heard of it.
怪しいな。 またよからぬことでも企んでるんじゃねえか、そこの。
Run with it, okay?
ないよ。
Sure.
戻って掃除の続きをするぞ、飛び丸。
Shojirou pat Tobimaru on the shoulder a couple of times and started walking. Tobimaru cast a doubtful glare in his direction as he meandered off. He had a feeling that Shojirou was covering for Kinomi somehow.
まさか、旧校舎に火なんてつけてないだろうな。
No, absolutely we did not set the old school building on fire.
誰もしないよ、そんなことは。
Exactly, who would even do that? Shojirou kept walking and did not even look back at Tobimaru as he spoke. Tobimaru and Kinomi tilted their heads in confusion as they reluctantly followed the unusually aggressive Shojirou back to their cleaning spot. And so the special winter cleaning team's activities ended uneventfully. The time was 3 in the afternoon. Upon departing, Kinomi and his crew invited Shojirou to come hang out with them, but he declined politely due to his job that evening. He had about 2 hours until his shift began. Not quite enough time to do anything fun, but just enough time to have to fill it with something. Shojirou thought about relaxing in a park somewhere, but quickly changed his mind after remembering how cold it was, even in the city. Not to forget that Aoko handed him those pills in the morning. Aoko was absolutely correct in her prediction. Heading back to the mansion now would just be a waste of time. There was no reason for him to return to the mansion until after his shift at work. Still, Shojirou found himself on the way back anyway. Having grown up deep in the mountains, a little 2-hour walk was really no sweat off his back. Damn. A 2-hour walk being just absolutely nothing? How nice for Shojirou. Mizaki was one of the more quiet residential areas in Mizaki City. The only thing that really stood out here was Shiroinzuka. It was built on a hill that led directly into the woods. The silhouette of the mountains served as a backdrop to suburbia, silently overshadowing the small human actions of the people who lived there. Even in this modern day of technological progress, the people here were always careful to pay reverence to the nature around them. If that mansion were a shrine, it would be a haunted house, but a famous tourist attraction.
というより、今さら気づいたけど。
The houses around Shiroinzuka were all magnificent. Shojirou understood as he looked from the bottom of this hill where the rest of the town lived, at the roof of the mansion tucked away in the woods. He understood that what Tobimaru was talking about how Kuwanji family who owned that mansion might be the richest people in town.
その割に家賃を取るところを見ると、やっぱり嫌われていると見るべきか。
Just to make you suffer even more than they already have you suffering. Shojirou began walking towards the mansion with such thoughts simmering in his mind. The feeling of the hard asphalt beneath his feet instead of soft dirt felt lonely and isolating. He walked along the paved road for 10 minutes or so before reaching the iron fence of the wood. Beyond this fence was the private property of the Kawanji family. It was bereft of any awkward no trespassing signs. The tall, overbearing iron fence was more than enough to remind visitors that they were unwelcome there. Shojirou casually pushed on the iron gate. Only 2 days had passed since the end of final exams, and he already seemed more than comfortable with the idea of entering this wood alone. The path to the mansion from inside the wood curved and bent like a snake. It took about 15 minutes to reach the mansion on this path. He could have chosen to ignore the long incline and travel in a straight line through the wood, but he would have expended significantly more energy in doing so. No, using the wooden path. Wooden path? Damn. Wonder how much it costs to maintain a wooden path year to year. Anyway, no, using the wooden path was the sensible option, barring an emergency. Upon entering the foyer, Shojirou heard a conversation coming from the drawing room. It was no doubt Aoko and Alice. Shojirou decided to join them. Ever since final exams had ended, Aoko and Alice had switched from their daily routine to a more irregular schedule. Aoko would disappear into Alice's room in the west wing of the mansion for a while, where she would remain. And Alice would go into Aoko's room, not to be seen again. Or they would vanish into the corridors leading around to the rear of the mansion, doing who knows what, where Shojirou was most certainly not allowed to enter. Not that he was interested in what they were doing, since Aoko and Alice did not seem to want to include him either, serving both parties nicely. For the time being, the Kawanji estate was pretty peaceful.
ただいま。
Shojirou quietly opened the door to the drawing room. Even though they tried not to be involved in each other's business, Shojirou made it a habit to greet them. The two girls sat across from him on the sofa. On the table in front of them was a large, extravagantly decorated mirror. Aoko was dressed for comfort, wearing jeans instead of her usual skirt. In stark contrast, Alice was dressed in her usual all black. Even though the break from school was well underway, the witch still insisted on wearing black. As Aoko had explained, it was probably because it was too much effort for Alice to wear anything else. Shojirou's thought was that he would like to see her wear something different. Aoko and Alice seemed to be in the middle of some sort of dispute. The air in the drawing room was tense. They both ignored his greeting. Alice only briefly looked at him.
じゃあ、東川の視点は？あそこの柱は白色だし、そう簡単には奪われないでしょ？
ええ。今のところ東川は侵食されていないけど、一つ隣の鈴穂の視点が消された以上、楽観はできないわ。残りの割り出しは今までより早くなる。
そっか。一個釣れれば、あとは芋づる式だもんね。反省したわ。甘く見てたのはこっちの方だった。ここからは、1週間単位の攻防になるわね。
The two continued their heated discussion from opposite sides of the table. Aoko neglected to even glance up at Shojirou. Shojirou sensed that she wanted to concentrate on the discussion at hand.
でも解せないな。あの夜に人形を出してくるタイミングといい、隠し方だけは一級品なうちの視点を短期間で特定することといい、こいつ、まず間違いなく市内にアジトを敷いてるわよね。なのに、なんで結界に異常がないんだろう。三崎市一帯の索敵網は、もう100年近く破られたことがないのに。
Aoko bit her nails nervously while Alice nodded along. It seemed as though she was wondering the same thing.
母もここの結界には触れなかった。岬の結界をかいくぐるには、あなたのおじいさんかそれ以上の技量を持つ魔術師でないと難しい。けどそれほどの魔術師なら逆に気配は隠しきれない。何か特殊な音響法かもしれないわね。ここ数年新しいサークルの話は聞かないけど。
何？シャーウッドの森？メイキングなら以前アリスの霧が粉砕したじゃない。あれ以上の音響があるっていうの？
例えばの話よ。今回の相手は
Oh,
こちら以上の技量を持っているか、こちらの知らない技術を持っているか。どちらにせよ評価を改めるべきね。私たち気づかないうちに追い
wow,
詰められているのかも。
Alice is admitting that they're dealing with somebody that's more powerful than the both of them? Damn. The two fell silent. Shojirou, after some internal deliberation, decided to break the silence.
や、ただいま。
Aoko finally looked up at him in response to his hesitant declaration.
いいからお風呂に入ってきたら？汚れてるわよ、宗十郎。
Oh, shit. And with that, Aoko returned her gaze to the mirror. Alice briefly looked up at Shojirou again before also returning her gaze to the mirror. Perhaps feeling at least somewhat satisfied that his greeting was acknowledged, Shojirou left the drawing room and closed the door behind him. Aoko was right. His clothes were a little soiled.
そうだな。もったいないけど、確かに。
Shojirou returned to his room, thinking that a bath might actually feel pretty nice in this cold weather, despite not really having broken a sweat at all during the day. He climbed the stairs from the foyer and up the climbed the stairs from the foyer and up the second flight into the attic. Unlike the other rooms in the mansion, this one had no frills to its decor. It was a little cumbersome to use as a living space, but comfortable enough for Shojirou. Everywhere else in the mansion was a little too gaudy for his tastes. As far as shelter and a place to sleep went, Shojirou was more than satisfied with his accommodations. There was no electricity in the attic. The only light crept in from a small skylight. Not that Shojirou minded. He was more accustomed to living without electricity than living with it. With only the faint winter light to guide him, he readied a change of clothes and a towel before heading down to the foyer. Despite the magnificent size of the mansion, there was only one bath in the whole building. And not a particularly large one at that. Whoever the architect was, he or she must not have thought a bath to be so important, or perhaps they were not the bath type. Shojirou descended to the foyer and made his way to the back of the stairs. He knocked on the door to the bath. As expected, there was no answer from the other side. The only other two occupants of the mansion were still talking in the drawing room. After confirming it was unoccupied, Shojirou quietly entered the bathroom. Even though Shojirou was not aware of it himself, as was common for him, the only hobby he had acquired since coming down from the mountains was taking a nice, relaxing bath. Shojirou had left, but the two girls were still locked in their heated discussion. Needless to say, the topic of their conversation was still that of the outsider mage who had appeared in Mizaki City last month. This was, after all, the problem that had occupied their time before this whole situation with Shojirou arose. Dealing with and eliminating the interloper who had set his or her sights on their territory.
今まではおとりにばっかり食いついてたから甘く見てたけど、それも計算づくだったのかしらね。こっちが油断してる隙に本命を一つ奪われた。この相手との戦いはこれからが本番ってことか。
The situation was growing more dire by the day. Until only a couple of days ago, the enemy had limited themselves to small skirmishes, but now they had shifted to a full-on offensive. Aoko had two major bounded fields she used for defense. One, the larger of the two, was placed around Mizaki City to detect magical energy and magecraft. This was used to observe and monitor visitors from outside the city, and was initially set up by Aoko's ancestors, the administrators of this territory, and had no way to be removed. The other was set up to energize and manage ley lines from within the territory. The 5 sigils carved into the earth made up a standard square-type array, protecting all that lay within its bounds. After some manipulation of the monoflow, the power within was directed to accumulate at the Kuwanji estate. That is to say, the bounded field existed to monopolize the magical energy within Mizaki City. There were 5 sigils in total, with the Kuwanji estate located in the center. If all 5 sigils were forcibly removed, Aoko's jurisdiction over this territory would be in title only. Without the power of the land to back them up, they would be forced to fight back against their invaders on equal ground, with only their own innate abilities to protect them. The only reason Alice and the inexperienced Aoko were able to defend this territory so far was because of these 2 fields. The dragnet that notified Aozaki of any threats was also her lifeline. But this time, their enemy had somehow slipped through the cracks and was running rampant. This was what the girls had to face, this was what the girls had to face up to.
どちらにせよ時間の問題ね。視点がすべて潰されたら、いよいよここでの籠城になるけど。いいの？青子。
別にいいんじゃないの？アリスの言う通り、残りの視点を消されるのは時間の問題なんだし。
I mean, the two of you could stop sitting on your butts and go on like the offensive for a change.
そりゃ敵のアジトを発見できれば同じだけど、それは絶対必要ってわけでもないでしょ？視点を消されても、私にはあんまり関係ないし。何より、館の守りはあんたがいる限り万全だしね。あっちの方からやってきてくれるなら、それこそ飛んで火にいる、よ。他に心配事なんてないでしょ？
そうね。敵が一人だけなら、その時は鏡の範囲をここに集中させて戦場にすればいい。私たちにとってその方が有利だったわ。
Alice touched the mirror on the table with her pale fingers. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. The mirror was another protector of Mizaki City, separate from Aozaki's bounded fields. More accurately, it was a ploy that existed only to protect Alice Kuwanji rather than Mizaki City itself. It generated a thick fog that acted as an invitation to any visitors, drawing them into its board game-like world. Alice referred to it only as the mirror, but it was known to her friends as the Mirror of Slumber. This was a magecraft that Alice Kuwanji wielded. Within the rippling surface of the mirror, an image of a castle began to form, and also a lush forest, a field, and a river. Aoko stared at the mirror in silence, before suddenly jumping to her feet off the sofa.
そうと決まれば、あとは行動あるのみね。出かけるわよ、アリス。とにかく現場を見ないことには始まらない。
Alice let out a tired sigh in response to Aoko's determination, then gave the mirror a gentle caress. The sound of dripping water filled the room. The mirror began to consume the table in a thick fog with a single caress from Alice.
順番に回るのなら、帰るのは朝になるわね。
まあまあ、そう億劫がらないで。ところでアリス、火の五芒星の退去ってこうだっけ？
Aoko traced the shape in the air with her fingers. She mimed a star shape, starting from the top, moving down to the right, from there to the upper left, and so on.
そろそろ壊すこと以外も覚えないとダメよ、青子。
Alice sat up from the sofa, letting out a heavy sigh. They both took their coats from the hangers and left the drawing room.
失礼ね。私だって日々成長してるわよ。この間のおまじないだってちゃんと成功したんだから。
おまじない？
簡単な暗示の呪文。ほら、アリスが教えてくれた 軽く弱く、うまく早く。チクタクチクタク、急げや急げってやつ。
そ
I
れ
don't,
本当？
I don't even remember that
ほ
one.
んともほんと。後で総重量に聞いてみなさい。
Alice swallowed her words, clearly displeased. She likely stopped herself in time to realize it was not worth the effort to take issue with.
けど留守中その彼はどうするの？
大丈夫でしょう。アリスの西館と開かずの間に入らなきゃ即死するようなことは。
Well, he probably won't try to go in the West Wing, so. Aoko responded hastily as she opened the door to the foyer. As soon as she did, just as quickly as Alice's doubts had gotten stuck in her throat, Aoko suddenly froze, unable to speak.
ですって。
And I'll still try to. Wow, I'm not entirely sure what I just saw, but. For a moment, Aoka wasn't sure what was standing before her. She could only stare at the glinting rays of sunlight creeping into the room as she reeled from the shock. Her mind was completely blank. It was as if she had just woken up from a nap, or a jack-in-the-box had just opened in her face. Shojirou was probably the only person who truly knew how long that dumbfounded silence went on.
あんた、こんなところで何してるのよ、一体。
Breaking Alice's mind is what he's doing. Aoko had finally found her voice.
何って着替えてるんだけど。
Shojiro's response was matter of fact. He offered no explanation as to why he was changing in the foyer and not the bathroom. Aoko was too shocked to read him the riot act. Shojirou was putting a shirt on after presumably just getting out from the bath. His neck was wrapped in bandages and he was completely shirtless. His hair was wet, but his skin wasn't glistening from the steam of hot water. He must have washed himself with nothing more than cold water. Though shocked as to why anyone would do such a thing in this cold weather, she let it slide. The source of her silent stupor was simply his body. Until now, she'd only seen him as harmless. Without his clothing to hide him, however, he was more fit than she'd ever imagined. For a rough mountain upbringing where one's body and strength meant survival, perhaps he was even a bit underdeveloped. And on top of that,
それ、傷跡なの？
Aoko asked cautiously. Shojirou followed her gaze. He had something that looked like a burn scar on his arm. It was random in appearance, nothing like Aoko's magic crest with its ordered patterns.
ああ、これか。ずいぶん前に野犬の群れに襲われて噛みつかれたんだ。命があっただけでも幸運だから。
A long time ago. He must be talking about when he was a child. Though his life was saved, it was apparent that he hadn't been able to receive proper treatment deep in the mountains where he lived. Those scars were proof of that. Considering it had happened so many years ago, it was likely they would never fade. If only for an instant, Aoko thought the wild scars left on his skin suited his lean body perfectly.
確かに、あまり気持ちのいいものじゃないな。自分の部屋で着替えるべきだった。
Shojirou sounded slightly ashamed as he put on his shirt, looking at Aoko standing there in cold silence. The two girls had no response. Shojirou headed for the stairs to go back to his room.
ちょっと待って、宗十郎。
Shojirou stopped and turned around.
なんていうか。
Aoko looked away awkwardly, apparently not knowing why she had stopped him herself.
なんか青崎らしくない。さっきから変だけど、熱でもあるんじゃないのか？あれから満足に寝てないだろ、二人とも。
He was, of course, referring to the final exams. From Shojiro's perspective, the amount of work Aoko put in seemed strange.
熱なんてないったら。そうじゃなくて、どうしてこんなところで着替えてたのよ、あんたは。
I mean, any rational person would want to know why he was changing in the foyer. Aoko was doing her best to keep up appearances, but for some reason, Shojiro was hesitant to say much more.
それは、言いづらいんだが、下着の管理はきちんとした方がいいと思う。どっちだかは知らないけど。
Wait, what? Somebody needs to take better care of their underwear? What the hell, Shojiro? Alice, who'd been completely silent behind Aoko, couldn't resist responding to that statement. Although she hadn't wanted to get involved, this was something she couldn't ignore.
言っておくけど、それは青子だから。
I must point out it was definitely Aoko. Oh, nothing like throwing your roommate under the bus. Alice's response was quick and to the point.
洗濯の当番は確かに私だったけど。
Aoko seemed like she was just holding back on going critical.
とにかく、もうすぐアルバイトだから着替えてくる。
Sensing that these two were probably about to get into an argument, Shojiro took his chance to leave. And with that, Shojiro briskly left the scene. Damn! Oh, that sneaky bastard! He just pieced out after causing a scene.
アリス。
It's friggin' hilarious.
とりあえず、片付けてくるわ。
Alice calmly walked into the bathroom. A few minutes later, just as the two were about to head out and fulfill their duties as mages, Aoko remembered something she wanted to ask.
そうだ、アリス。傷ってあれのこと？
あれは傷跡じゃないわ。だって、 あんなにも誇らしいもの。
Aoko agreed. What had impressed her the most about those scars was how he treated them simply as part of his past, absent of any regret. Aoko wouldn't have gone as far as to say as he was proud, but it seemed her instincts had been correct. That and one more thing.
でも一つだけはっきりしたわ。それじゃあ、不覚にも見惚れてたのは私一人じゃなかったってことよね、アリス。
Aoko smiled warily at Alice like a child who knew they were doing something they shouldn't with their friend. Alice was trying to ignore her as best she could. She looked away without saying a word. Aoko let out a satisfied snicker and began walking toward the front door.
じゃ、行こうか。まずはあの公園からでいいでしょ。今回の件は、あそこから全てが始まったわけだし。
She was talking about the local park in Mizaki, the place where they had run into the enemy puppets, and of course, where their involvement with Shojirou had all begun. Early the next morning, it was 5 o'clock in the morning. Most people were still in their beds sleeping. Although some 24-hour convenience stores had opened last year, Mizaki Town was still very much living in the good old days of the early 80s. Even the tofu shop in the shopping district, known for opening earlier than anywhere else, didn't open until 6. But this was the late 80s, during the latter half of Japan's bubble economy. It was a time when metropolitan area never slept. Those in the countryside, however, remained in the past. The homes were blanketed in silence, the streets were empty of commuters, and not a single automobile could be heard. The sun was just barely peeking over the horizon. The town would still be asleep for at least an hour longer before it began waking up. It was during this time that someone stepped onto the Kawanji estate. Shojirou was working the late shift during the winter vacation and had just come home. He moved quietly through the drawing room so he wouldn't wake up Aoko and Alice, who were presumably still asleep. The Kawanji estate had a few established rules. One of those rules forbade more Japanese tea. This new rule had only come into effect 3 days prior. Probably because Shojirou really screwed up the last of Alice's really expensive tea. Oh no. No more Japanese teas. That is so sad. It was proposed after Alice saw Shojirou drinking green tea in the kitchen after dinner one night. What's wrong with that? Honestly, what's wrong with green tea after dinner? Looking back on it, the decision had been made rather abruptly. That single gasp of surprise was all Alice said. She grasped her head as if she was baiting the battling the most vicious of migraines, called for Aoko, and then made the decision to ban all Japanese teas from the mansion. By some miracle, Aoko managed to negotiate and keep Shojiro's privileges to barely tea during the summer.
だいたいイギリス産だって初めはグリーンティーが主流だったじゃない。
Aoko had clearly hit a nerve with this argument. Aoko stared at Alice, fairly certain why she was so taken aback by Shojiro's actions.
そこまで嫌がらなくてもな。お茶は何だって美味しいのに。
I agree. Well, I mean, there are several kinds of tea that I'm not overly fond of, but for the most part, I have only found a few teas that I don't like, and the vast majority of them that I do. Shojirou grumbled to himself while sipping his hot green tea. He didn't realize that Alice was upset because he had poured his green tea into a teacup meant for black tea. Oh, that's her issue. It's the cup that he's drinking it from. Apparently, she's like such a hoity-toity that you have to have certain cups for certain teas. In Shojiro's defense, this was the only teacup that Alice had given him permission to use. At any rate, the early morning was his to enjoy. This was his moment to relax with the Japanese tea set he'd smuggled in. He didn't use this time to read books or watch TV. He just drank his tea and gazed fondly at the garden, or rather, the dense woods outside. Shojirou simply sat relaxed and let his mind wander. About an hour passed. Just as he was beginning to feel refreshed, he heard sounds coming from the foyer. He knew it was Aoko and Alice talking, so he rushed to hide his teacup, teapot, and tea leaves in the kitchen. Hiding the contraband was easy enough considering just how many unused shelves there were in the kitchen. Shojirou was perturbed by how they wasted the potential of such a splendid kitchen.
あら、早いのね、宗十郎。
Aoko spoke as she took off her white down jacket. Next to her, Alice silently took off her black coat.
いや、今帰ってきたんだ。天城浜の食品工場に深夜のパートで入ることになって。その帰り。
Shojirou stuck his hand out from the kitchen and gestured that he was about to put on some water to boil. Alice tilted her head slightly at him. It wasn't that she thought his gesturing was funny or anything like that.
天城浜から
Uh-oh. Alice glanced up at the clock in the drawing room, and her expression darkened.
どうしたのアリス。
Aoko asked this from her comfortable seat on the sofa.
別に
Alice responded indifferently before finally sitting down as well.
宗十郎、砂糖は一杯だけだからね。
Oh, you've had some extremely unpleasant teas, have you? I'm sorry to hear that you got yourself a tea and it was less than impressive, we'll say. That is most unfortunate. Aoko yelled her matter-of-course request to the kitchen. Shojirou didn't respond, but it was an affirmative silence. This was the result of the 2 entire nights worth of cramming that Alice knew nothing about.
アリスは？
私はミルクだけでいいけど。
You're trusting his tea making skills, Alice? Are you sure you want to do that? Alice responded out of obligation.
了解。ミルクティーだね。
For some reason, Shojirou dutifully answered Alice's request.
ま、いいけど、いちいち突っ込んでたらキリがないし。
Aw, Aoko, are you a little jealous that he answered Alice and not you?
それより珍しいじゃない。アリスがティーバッグのお茶飲むなんて。
今日は疲れたから、たまには。
It seemed she had allowed herself to accept another's kindness, at least for today.
ま、いいか。それより宗十郎。あんた、さっきおかしなこと言わなかった？
When doesn't he say something weird?
え？別に言ってないぞ、そんなこと。
そう、ならいいんだけど。
Two were conversing over a distance of 4 yards. Alice decided to add her opinion to the conversation.
しずきくんがおかしなことを言わない日はないと思うわ、私。
I just said that. I agree totally with Alice. There has not been a day that has gone by that something came out of Shojirou's mouth that didn't sound weird to somebody at some point. Her quiet tone was luckily just low enough that Shojirou couldn't hear her from the kitchen.
そりゃそうだけど、今ちょっと変だったでしょ？いや、何が引っかかったのかまではわからないんだけどさ。
そうね。会話自体は普通だったけれど、内容を考えてみると、どこかおかしいわね。
Aoko became gradually more irritated as she failed to grasp what had been odd about the conversation. Just then, Shojirou appeared holding a tray with a teacup for each of them.
何を話してるんだ？単に新しいアルバイトを始めただけだろ。
He put the cups down on the black table without making even the slightest sound. Alice couldn't complain about how proper his job as a waiter had made him. While she didn't say anything out loud, she did nod in his direction to show some gratitude. Aoko, however,
天城浜だっけ？あそこってスタジアムがあるところでしょ？ツアーの会場になるから時々行くけど。
the student council president, a supposed model student, loved rock bands. Aoko was secretly obsessed with a number of bands that used to travel way out of town just to see them perform live when she was in middle school. Of course, this was a world that Shojirou was far from familiar with.
それより、また新しいバイト始めたんだ。そんなに働いてどうする気なのよ、宗十郎は。
ああ、よく聞いてくれたね。本人の名誉のために名前は伏せるけど、誰かさんと誰かさんが俺の少ない収入を無慈悲に奪っていくから働く先を増やしたんだ。
This was as much resistance as Shojirou was able to give. Aoko lifted her teacup to her mouth as if she was completely oblivious to Shojirou's monologue.
それは大変ね。
Alice said this as she set her teacup down quietly. There were some things she just did not understand. Aoko had to hold back her laughter as she looked at Alice and Shojirou.
はあ、言った自分が未熟だった。
Shojirou's shoulders fell as he said this. He took a sip of his black tea, still unsure about the taste.
まあ、アルバイトが多いって分かってくれるだけでいいか。そういったわけだから、冬休み中は夜も留守にする。例の薬はアルバイト先で飲むしかないんだけど。
ああ、それなら心配いらないわ。もうあれはやめたから。
Oh, what? We're not taking the pills anymore?
いちいち作るのも面倒だし、もっとしずきくんに似合うのを見つけてきたの。
Wonderful. Aoko had a huge, ominous grin on her face. She put her hand into her jacket pocket and pulled out a little paper bag. It was a small, circular object about 20 inches in diameter, wrapped up nicely like a present.
はい、これは入居祝い。これからはそれをつけておくのよ、宗十郎。
Shojirou opened up the paper bag. Inside was a white belt. But it wasn't a belt for putting around your waist to keep your pants up. To put it as clearly as possible, it was a collar.
Aoko.
Alice's expression darkened at this turn of events. But it wasn't clear whether it was her friend's insidiousness or sympathy for Shojirou that concerned her.
どう？気に入った？
That's just mean. Oh, to have that happy look at a face when you're asking somebody what you think of the collar you just asked them to wear. Damn. Aoko was clearly a little crazy. At least she wasn't totally serious. No, I really think she was. It was obvious that this was at least half a prank, just to see how Shojirou would react. But Shojirou was solemnly considering the collar he had just been gifted.
うん。意味はつかみかねるけど、こういうものを人からもらうのはこれが初めてだ。
He actually sounded like this would be a happy memory for him. Alice narrowed her eyes at what was transpiring.
けど、これは何に使うんだ？
簡単よ。金庫寺と同じで、飼い犬が主人に逆らうと首を絞めるの。あっちは頭につけてたけど、それよりは首のがマシでしょ？
Just straight up, you know, put it around your neck like a dog collar, you little puppy. I mean, come on. Shojirou grimaced when he finally understood Aoko's mean-spirited gift. He really wanted to ask her what kind of person comes up with such an evil idea.
つまり、秘密をばらしたり逆らったりしたら首が締まると。やっぱり熱でもあるんじゃないのか、青崎は。
No shit, are you sure you're feeling well?
あら、首輪は嫌？せっかく宗十郎に似合いそうなものを見つけたのに。
Aoko still had an evil grin on her face. But Shojirou had a surprising response to the gift that Aoko clearly gotten as a prank.
それもそうか。毎日毒を飲むよりはマシだし、このベルト自体いいものだし。うん、気に入った。ありがとう、青崎。
Oh man. Oh, and she doesn't realize that he doesn't know it's a joke. He spoke 100% truthfully. Aoko's face contorted in disbelief as she could only mumble, if he was serious.
人の好意はどんなものだって嬉しいよ。それに、それが青崎ならなおさらだ。
And with that, Shojirou put the belt around his neck. He placed it over the bandages already there.
こんな感じかな？きついけどそのうち慣れるだろう。
Despite his words to the contrary, Shojirou tugged at the belt uncomfortably and adjusted it. It was such a perverse scene that even Aoko's face was red as a beet, even though this had all been her idea. Perhaps it was because it gave her such a clear reminder of the scars she had seen the day before.
よし。止め方はこれでいいのか？
ね、
Aoko retreated guiltily as Shojirou came closer for her to check the fit of his new collar.
黙ってちゃわからないのに。いいよ。アリスに聞くから。
Shojirou shifted his gaze from Aoko to Alice. Alice stared intently at Shojirou wearing his new collar and said,
ロックね。青子、趣味に走りすぎよ。
could not have put it any more bluntly.
いや、やかましい！そんなんじゃない！もういい！とにかくそういうことよ！これからはその首輪が薬の代わりよ！せいぜい秘密を守ることね！
Oh. I gotta go with Alice on that one. That was hilariously well done. Oh, man. Aoko was oddly empathic as she spoke before stomping off toward the hallway.
それと、これからお昼まで仮眠を取るけど、くだらないことで起こしたら殺すから！
I think Alice touched a nerve with that one. Aoko slammed the door behind her as she left the drawing room. Shojirou stared in amazement.
なんで青崎はいつもいきなり怒るんだろう。
He murmured to himself, forgetting that Alice was standing right there in front of him.
しずきくんには悪意が通じないか
Looks
ら
like
でしょ
she's behind him
う。
today.
気にする必要はないわ。
悪意って今のが？
Yes, just now. Alice looked up at Shojirou's innocent response. There was a glimmer in her eye that showed surprise at her current actions.
なんでもないから気にしないで。
You were gonna tell him and then chose not to. Aw, Alice, you were so close. With that tense reply, she returned to her usual expressionless self. There was no use explaining Aoko's feelings. Aoko bought that collar for the sole purpose of annoying Shojirou and causing mischief. When things didn't turn out how she'd planned, her conscience got the better of her. Shojirou mistakenly thought that Aoko was angry at him when in reality she was only angry at herself. Alice didn't bother telling Shojirou all these heartwarming details, though. Not because it was too much work, just because she was never one to have meaningless conversation. That was how she had been raised.
しずきくんはこれからどうするの？
Alice suddenly changed the topic. Shojirou thought for a while before replying.
夕方までゆっくりするよ。ここのところ忙しすぎた。せっかくだからテレビも見ていたいし、お昼には青崎を起こさないといけないだろ。
そう。なら静かにしていて。
Alice let out a gentle sigh and rose to her feet. Just keep it quiet. Shojirou would understand exactly what she meant by those words in just a few minutes. The sun shining through the window was bright. It was just about 9 o'clock, about the time for morning television programs to get going. Shojirou was sitting on the sofa, staring out the window at the scene outside. The view from the neighboring sunroom showed a courtyard in a state of disrepair. Shojirou could appreciate the outdoors in both its natural, wild state and when tamed by human hands.
あれは近いうちに何とかせねばなるまい。
Shojirou muttered to himself, turning another page in his textbook. On the table before him was a mathematics textbook and a notebook with Aoko's name on it. Although at first glance he appeared to be a diligent student studying on his day off, he was in truth only doing so as a compromise. He had given up on his main intent of watching the morning television shows. The reason why he gave up on this was simple. He was being considerate of Alice, who sat in front of him with her nose buried in a book. Instead of holding herself up in her room, she brought her old dusty books to read. This was what she meant when she said to keep quiet. Shojirou found it difficult to turn on the TV.
とりあえずしばらくテレビは控えよう。
With that decision, Shojirou resigned himself to reviewing some of the practice problems he'd gotten wrong. In the drawing room, for some reason, there wasn't any particular purpose in doing it there. But he also had no real reason to study back up in his room. And there he was, leisurely highlighting his textbook with Alice there in the same room. To Shojirou, there was really no difference between his room in the attic and the drawing room with Alice. To be fair, he could probably live with a tiger as long as it didn't cause any trouble. That was both Shojirou's biggest strength and his biggest weakness. Before he knew it, the clock was showing 11. He'd spent 2 hours doing his math problems, but wasn't even halfway finished. More than that, he was disappointed in himself for lacking the courage to speak up at all.
それに比べて青崎は頑張ってる。
He dropped his mechanical pencil onto the notebook and watched it roll away. He knew that Aoko and Alice were busy with something since final exams had ended. He also knew that she had hardly gotten any sleep recently. If she had been able to ignore him during exams, she probably would have had an easier time. Today's nap was probably the first proper sleep Aoko had gotten in days. Though she showed no signs of exhaustion, despite the fact that she must have hit peak long ago, she always seemed raring to go. It wasn't that she was trying to act tough. That was just the kind of person she was. Always positive, always tough as nails. And that was exactly why she came off as completely irrational at times. But if that was the case, you could probably describe Alice in exactly the same way. Shojirou couldn't help but feel a bit inadequate when he saw their single-minded focus on their goals. He'd been so preoccupied with adjusting to his new life that he'd neglected to think about what he was going to do with himself after. Thinking about this cast a gloomy cloud over his heart. He felt like he'd never find a clear purpose in life. Aoko and Alice seemed to have. At least not since he'd left the mountains. His old life was gone now, never to return. He was like a kite cut off its string, destined to fly only where the winds took it. And without anything to ground him, he couldn't do anything about the empty future that lay ahead. He could only let himself fly where the currents took him, slowly losing sight of the ground below.
そうだな。便利なものは溢れているけど、本当に望むものは。
The town was full of options, but he could find nothing. He asked himself the same question time and time again. It never made him feel any better. If anything, it only made him feel worse and worse. That, or maybe the feeling that lamented his own impudent world led to finding some kind of goal or desire someday. Tired of his own sniveling, Shojirou dejectedly closed his notebook. When he looked up, he saw his own face reflected back at him in the TV screen. His new collar there around his neck, looking as out of place as ever. Perhaps a fool like him who felt weak when faced with other strengths didn't need to wear a collar after all.
まったくだ。悩むのは一丁前になってから。
He shook off his thoughts of doom and gloom and sat up straight. After psyching himself up a little, he stood up from the sofa.
よし。何か作るけど、アリスは？
Shojirou asked casually. While Shojirou had been doing his own thing, he had remained mindful of Alice. Alice looked up, surprised at hearing her name. She had completely forgotten Shojirou was even there.
私？
Yes, you. There's nobody else in the room, you silly.
ああ。アリス、朝から紅茶しか飲んでないだろ。どうせ作るなら、いっぱい作った方がお得なんだ。
Without waiting for her to reply, Shojirou headed off to the kitchen while putting on his apron. Alice tried to wave at him to stop, but by then he'd already disappeared into the kitchen. She was hesitant to walk all the way in there just to tell him she didn't need anything. And besides, she was actually hungry. Shojirou's proposal made sense, and her empty stomach agreed. Alice was hungry, and Shojirou was going to make lunch. Making lunch for both of them would save the time and trouble of cooking 2 separate meals. There was no logical reason for Alice to refuse his gesture. She decided to stay quiet and tactfully accept his offer.
変な人。
She whispered the words softly, not for anyone in particular to hear but herself. The truth was, however, Alice had been in a bad mood all morning. After checking all the signals around Mizaki City and boarding the first train back to Tokawa, all she wanted to do was spend the rest of the day reading until the words turned into a jumble. Her iron resolve to complete this task would not be interrupted by someone else milling about the drawing room. This was her mansion, and there was no way she was going to lock herself up in her room on account of Shojirou. However, with that said, she knew it would be wrong to kick Shojirou out for no real reason. As it stood, Shojirou had actually kept quiet like she'd asked. He wasn't in the wrong here. If Alice had really wanted to be alone, she should have gone to her room.
静かにしてじゃなくて一人にさせてと言うべきだった。
Alice had definitely stayed in the drawing room despite realizing the dilemma she'd put herself in. She had figured Shojirou would eventually make a ruckus and run off to hide in his attic room. Her assumption could not have been more wrong. Shojirou never left the drawing room. Moreover, she had actually stopped caring that he was there. Though he hadn't paid her any attention, he hadn't ignored her either. They had simply sat in silence together without any awkwardness. Alice felt the freedom of being alone along with the comfort of someone being by her side. To put it into words, Shojirou was just that kind of person. That was probably the only reason Alice had been able to sleep so soundly with him there next to her. Shojirou continued cooking in the kitchen, oblivious to the thoughts that went through Alice's head. She couldn't see him from the drawing room, but she could easily imagine him cooking in the kitchen.
変な人ね。本当に。
Alice resumed reading after unwittingly stating her feelings out loud a second time. The sunlight beaming into the drawing room shone that it was now noon. The sunlight actually looked warm despite being a cloudy winter day. Just as noon struck, Shojirou returned to the drawing room with 2 sets of plates. Some food of an indescribable color was piled on large cream-colored plates.
これは
She hadn't expected much. And since she hadn't requested anything, she could just refuse it if it was something she didn't want. But this food left her at a loss for words despite psyching herself up.
これは何？
Alice spoke as though she were terrified of what had been placed before her.
何って、焼きうどんに何かかけてみた。
If Aoko had been there, she probably would have punched him. But Shojirou just confidently placed the two large plates on the table. Steam billowed from the mountain of food like an angry volcano ready to erupt at any moment. The thick mystery sauce that flowed over the plates as magma might from said eruption. And below it were all seemingly infinite number of slimy tentacle-like noodles. There really was nothing to say about it. This was clearly the food of a poor, struggling student who favored quantity over quality. All that required was a basic recipe, the will to cook something, and what few ingredients were needed. The pile of stir-fried noodles with sauce slathered on top was so horrifically bad, it was almost an art form. This was a bachelor's cooking if she'd ever seen it. There really was nothing else you could call it. I'm not sure what that is, but I don't know if I'd want to eat it. She'd wondered what he was doing for an hour in there, and it turned out he'd been making this sauce. With what? No, sauce wouldn't have been fine, but Shojirou had wholeheartedly gone the extra mile. Shojirou bowed his head slightly and picked up his chopsticks. He had brought a fork for Alice. Who's very hesitant to try this, whatever this is. She picked up the fork and stuck it into the noodles, half drowning in sauce. Shojirou began eating, not seeming to care that Alice sat there looking like she was about to eat poison. Seeming to view this as a challenge, Alice furrowed her brow and slowly brought the mass of noodles to her mouth. It was a little salty and ugly to look at, but it didn't taste all that bad. If anything, it was actually pretty good.
一つ聞きたいんだけど。
Shojirou put down his chopsticks and turned to speak to Alice.
実際の話、魔術師の話はともかくとして、青崎はまだ誰にも手を出してないんじゃないか。
Alice looked up quietly at the sudden question. She had been inspecting Shojirou's meal, but now she looked straight at him.
おかしなことを聞くのね、しずきくんは。
アリスには悪いけど、これは青崎本人には聞きようのないことだから。言いたくなければ答えないでくれ。
Yeah, I suppose I'd feel uncomfortable asking Aoko that question too. Alice didn't respond. Shojirou resumed eating, not seeming disappointed. Alice stared blankly at him, slurping his noodles. After much hesitation, she replied,
しずきくんの言う通り、青子はまだ人を殺したことはないわ。その行為自体は何回かこなしてはいるけれど。
Alice's response was slow and measured. Shojirou still looked troubled. But not at the conversation they were having. Rather, he looked apologetic towards Alice. He said she didn't have to answer if she didn't want to. But Alice kept talking despite the face she was making.
しずきくんが見た公園での出来事が、青子にとって初めての殺人行為を。
Shojirou silently nodded. Alice narrowed her eyes at him suspiciously.
まるで、初めから分かっていた素振りね。
そうじゃな。いや、そうなのかな。たまにその手のセリフを言うけど、何か違う気がしたんだ。だから多分、青崎はまだ人殺しというのを体験していないんじゃないかって。
Yes, appearances are not everything. You can never judge a book by its cover. He talks a big game, but she still has yet to actually kill anything that isn't a puppet. And even that was her first time offing a puppet.
でもまあ、そんなことよりもっと確かなのは、
しずきくんが今生きているということね。
I mean, if she was a more seasoned mage, she may have just outright killed Shojirou months ago, actually. Shojirou chuckled at Alice's stellar response. Exactly. Things would have gone more clear-cut than that night if Aoko had actually killed someone before. Shojirou would have been dead before he ever saw her face. For better or worse, Aoko remained inexperienced in spite of her ruthlessness and decisiveness. Shojirou relaxed his shoulders. His stern face gradually returned to its normal, carefree state. Then,
でも、そんなことは関係ないわ。あの子はそのあたりが異常だから。行為は理性に、経験は知識でたやすく補ってしまう。そうね。青子はその気になれば、迷うことなく人の命に手を出せる。しずきくん風に言うのなら。
honestly, I think that is what bothers Aoko the most, is that she could do it without hesitation if she really wanted to. And with that, Alice went back to twirling noodles around her fork. She looked like she was having fun, Shojirou thought, as he ruminated over what she had just said. She was rational enough to accept herself despite acting against society's morals, and possessed of an intellect that exceeded even the confidence gained through experience. Had Aoko been raised to utilize her logic and reason to forge reality from fiction? If that was the case, then perhaps they really were different from Shojirou.
すまない。こんなことを聞いたのは、青崎には内緒にしておいてくれないか。
Shojirou seemed serious, as if he really regretted asking. Alice's expression remained unchanged, but she had never intended on saying anything to Aoko anyway.
ありがとう。なんだか、アリスには内緒話ばかり溜まっていくね。
Shojirou went back to eating his food. Though Alice still only had a single bite, he was already scraping his clean.
そういえば青崎にも聞いたんだけど、アリスと青崎はいつもああなのか？
Shojirou had suddenly decided to change the topic of conversation. His new topic was the rather cold and dry relationship between Aoko and Alice. Aoko had said their relationship was normal, but maybe Alice had a different opinion.
会話が少ないことを言っているのなら、そうなるわ。けど、別に不便じゃないから。
Alice was still twirling her noodles with her fork as she gave her concise answer. Around and around the noodles went, but none made it into her mouth.
不便じゃないって、そういうの仲がいいって言わないんじゃないのか。
私と青子の仲が良くないと、しずきくんは困るの？
Shojirou swallowed his words at Alice's perplexed reply. It would actually. It would actually. But he wasn't sure how to respond when asked so directly.
いや、なんかこっちの考え方が悪かったみたいだ。もうその話題には触れないことにしたから忘れてくれ。それより、アリス。
Shojirou gave Alice a piercing stare that was more intense than any time they'd talked before. Alice was taken slightly aback at the unusually intense look in his eyes. Her face became slightly flushed out of nervousness. Nobody besides Aoko had ever stared at her like this before. Whether or not he noticed, Shojirou waited a few moments before speaking slowly with complete conviction.
それ、食べないなら欲しいんだけど。
Oh, man. An awkward silence followed.
悪いけど、これ、私のだから。
No, you can't have it. It's mine. I'm gonna play with it until I'm done playing with it, then I might eat it. Suzuki cooked it, sure. But Alice wasn't wrong. He had made it for her, after all. There was a slight tinge of anger in her voice, but even she wasn't sure why it was there.
そうだね。少し意地汚かった。
Shojirou plopped himself down on the sofa. This must have looked particularly pathetic to Alice, since she responded with,
その、材料はもう残ってないの？
Apparently she really likes it. She quickly covered her mouth. Apparently she had surprised even herself. It was quite unusual for her to ask something like that.
残ってないよ。青崎の分も作っちゃったから。
Shojirou stared a bit regretfully at Alice's plate as he responded. Alice could have just let it go, but for some reason she felt the need to speak up again.
青子なら、眠っているけど。
いや、もうすぐ起こすから。起きた後で作らされるより、一緒に作っておいた方が楽だしね。と、もうすぐ1時か。ちょうどいい。行って起こしてくるよ。
青子は、起こしたら殺すって言ってたけど。
She did in fact say she would kill him if he woke. If she was woken up for any reason, she would kill him. Alice wasn't sure why Shojirou was willing to take such a risk. Shojirou agreed, but started walking anyway.
でもさ、今起こしておかないと、やっぱり後で殺される運命にあると思うんだ。
I mean, she might be like, I'm gonna kill you for not waking me up. His words were surprisingly affectionate. Leaving Alice with only that, Shojirou headed to Aoko's room. Alice watched him leave in silence before taking another bite of stir-fried noodles. Glancing at the door to the hallway to make sure nobody was coming, she took another bite. She repeated that process many times before finishing her food. It was then that she heard Aoko's wrath coming from the second floor. Alice stood up and began solemnly clearing the table, feeling a bit sorry for what Shojirou was dealing with. She knew she didn't really have to, but she felt like it was the least she could do for him. She'd never really expected to feel this way. But he'd cooked for her, and it was surprisingly good, almost enough to make her forget how bad he was at making tea. All right, guys. Well, we are going to call this one here. Again, it seems like at the end of the episode is a good place to call it. Thank you to everyone who joined me for today's stream. I really appreciate you guys being here to enjoy this adventure with me. It makes it so much better that way. All right, well, we have a One Piece video coming out for you guys tomorrow. And I think we'll probably have another Fate Samurai Remnant test episode on Tuesday. But we'll figure that out in a little bit. Well, thank you very much. It's nice to know that you guys enjoy the content. Warms my little kitty heart. All right, guys. Well, we'll see you in the next one. Bye for meow.